What if Daniel died in the lion's den? Would Persia change? Picture the torchlight smearing gold over stone. The roar below is not metaphor but breath, hot and wet, curling from the throats of living lions. A ringed hand presses a seal into wax. A king turns away, heart heavy, and an old man is lowered into darkness. In our familiar telling, the morning opens like a flower. But in this world, the night swallows him whole. No voice answers at dawn. The den is quiet, and the ripples move outward, from a single sealed pit to an empire that stretches from Egypt to the mountains of Media. Before we step off the known path, let's walk it once by starlight. Daniel's story sits in the long shadow of exile. Jerusalem has fallen. Babylon's gates swallowed Judah's best and brightest, and among them was a young man named Daniel. He grew up under foreign ceilings, learned foreign laws, and somehow refused to let go of the name of his God. Kingdoms toppled around him. Babylon fell to Persia like a tower of wet sand, and a new ruler, Darius, set his house in order with satraps and officials. Daniel rose among them. He didn't belong, and yet he did. Integrity makes space where politics does not. That is exactly what made others jealous. They needed a trap that used Daniel's own spine against him. A 30-day law, polite and lethal. No petition to any god or man except the king. The kind of law that makes obedience to conscience look like treason. Daniel, unshaken, opens his windows toward Jerusalem and prays, as he has always done. He does not perform. He simply refuses to vanish. Arrest follows, papers rustle. The king realizes too late that the net he signed was for the one man he trusted most. But the law of the Medes and Persians is iron. It doesn't bend after it is forged. Daniel is lowered into the den. A stone, a seal, a sleepless king. In the canonical dawn, the king runs. He calls out into the dark and hears a voice. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. The stone is lifted, the old man steps out, and the king does something extraordinary. He writes across the empire that the God of Daniel is living, enduring, and worth honoring. The conspirators fall into their own pit. And in that one day, a private act of faith echoes through public policy. Now we turn the hinge. In this respectful, speculative world, Daniel does not answer the king. The lions do what lions do. Darius arrives to silence. The stone lifts on a scene that cannot be reversed, cannot be rewritten by decree. A faithful life is gone. What changes? First, the immediate court. Power hates the vacuum that a righteous person leaves behind. Without Daniel's vindication, the plotters breathe easier. The legal precedent they crafted holds. State devotion, if only for 30 days, can supersede private worship. The king still grieves, but grief without miracle rarely becomes policy. He will not, he cannot, issue a sweeping proclamation about Daniel's God. The empire's message remains what the seal already said. The law stands as written. The scribes take note. Future laws will remember the stiffness of this one. Without that royal reversal, the bureaucracy learns a darker lesson. Prayer is harmless until it is not. This is the seed of caution that grows into a vine. The official class becomes more confident in using piety tests to target rivals. Such tactics don't need to become universal, merely available. And once a tool is available in a state that stretches from the Nile to the Indus, somebody will use it again. Now widen the lens. In our known history and scripture, a few years after Babylon's fall, Cyrus issues a decree allowing exiles, including the Judeans, to return and rebuild. Was Daniel behind it? The text doesn't say. Later traditions imagine conversations between prophet and king, scrolls unfurled before the eyes of power. In our cautious speculation, Daniel's absence doesn't guarantee that decree disappears. Cyrus was both conqueror and pragmatic administrator. He often supported local cults as a strategy to stabilize new lands. But the loss of Daniel, and of any public proclamation by Darius that elevated the God of Israel, tilts the scales. So the return does not vanish, but it softens. Fewer pack their lives and go. Fewer shoulders lean into the first stones of a second temple. The rebuilding that faced opposition in any timeline now faces it with less momentum, less credibility, and a memory of an empire that once legally crushed a faithful man. Older exiles, who would have carried hometown stories into new foundations, decide to stay by the canals of Babylon and the markets of Susa. A community that had thought of itself as temporary begins to put down permanent roots. This means something both subtle and massive. The diaspora becomes not Plan B, but Plan A. Synagogue life, already emergent, blossoms sooner. Portable holiness, text, prayer, community, consolidates identity in ways a stone temple used to do. In Jerusalem, a modest sanctuary rises, slow and underfunded. Or perhaps it stalls until a later Persian monarch gathers the nerve to allow more bold rebuilding. The hilltop is not empty, but it is quieter. Fewer pilgrims, less noise in the streets at feast days. A capital that might have become a magnet is now a memory that many honor from far away, with open windows and morning prayers. Religion in Persia absorbs the shift as well. Without a royal edict praising Daniel's god, the court's religious language remains more formally Zoroastrian, or for those who prefer the broader label, centered on imperial rituals that value order over testimony. A lesson hardens. The empire survives when subjects face outward, not upward. In such a climate, minority faiths still live, but they learn to make themselves small. In the borderlands, Elephantine in Egypt, the trading posts of Asia Minor, Jewish communities adapt faster. They petition local authorities to maintain their own altars as stopgaps, temples that would have been unthinkable if Jerusalem's house were vigorous. The Elephantine papyri in this world are not an odd fragment of a distant community. They are a clue to a broader pattern. Local sanctuaries rise where a grand center falters. Every decision carries forward. When Darius the Great and Xerxes later assemble their machines of governance, they inherit a memory of this earlier law. Their satraps remember that someone once used a 30-day devotion test to break the spine of a rival. The law does not reappear everywhere, but in pockets and seasons, it is enough. People who might have stood tall decide to survive instead. Faithful courage becomes more private. The empire grows slightly more brittle in its heart, and slightly more flexible in its edges. Two qualities that can coexist for generations without anyone noticing. This world still meets Alexander. Macedonian speed still slices Persian rank and file. But the map he enters is different at its small, crucial nodes. Judea is not a fervent center with a freshly rebuilt temple and a thick crowd of identity at its core. It is a satrapy of fewer passions and more practical compromises. Discussions with Greek governors are terse, but not explosive. There are fewer riots over altars and bulls and divine names. Fewer sabers rattle in Jerusalem because fewer sabers live there. The great crisis that, in our remembered timeline, erupts under Antiochus, when the temple is desecrated and the Maccabean revolt sparks, finds less tinder. The priestly families in a quieter Jerusalem have less leverage and less popular energy to resist. Their cousins in Babylon, already confident in synagogue life without temple centrality, counsel patience, not war. A revolt still may rise, but it is smaller, slower, less successful. It fizzles into a protest rather than a revolution, a page in a scroll rather than a parade in the streets. Without a strong hasmonean state, the region remains a province threaded by roads instead of a kingdom that later bargains with Rome. This single change ripples straight into the Roman century. Rome loves provinces that do not dream of crowns. Administration is easier where identity gathers in homes and houses of study rather than in grand courtyards. Herod, if he rises at all, rules a narrower domain. There is no glittering expansion to tempt emperors into building projects that double as statements. The hill remains sacred, yes, but less central in politics. The census stirs less uproar. The Passover crowds are not absent, but smaller. Tension remains. This is still a crossroads, but the flashpoints are fewer. Midway through this river of consequences, let's pause together. If Daniel's death dims the energy around a rebuilt Jerusalem, does that lead to a quieter resilience across the diaspora? Or does it mean a long, slow erosion of hope? Which outcome do you find more plausible in this what if? Share your read in the comments. And if thoughtful journeys like this one are your kind of story, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter. Keep following the current. The teachings that will stitch Jewish life together after any catastrophe now stitch it together earlier. Scribes become linchpins sooner. Collections of law and tradition firm up not just in Jerusalem but in Babylon, Susa, and the cities where caravans pause. The pulse of faith moves along trade routes. In this world, when Greek becomes the language of towns along the Mediterranean, the translation of scripture in Alexandria still happens, but it is joined by a surge of Aramaic, and later, Syriac study further east. The eastward spine of Jewish learning thickens earlier, making Mesopotamia even more of a center of gravity. This matters when we peer ahead to the 1st century. In our known story, a teacher from Nazareth steps into a Jerusalem that hums with the energy of feasts and factions and temple debate. He speaks on hillsides and in courtyards. He clears tables. He is recognized and resisted in equal measure in a city that is both sacred and political. In this alternate world, the city is still holy, but the political heat is lower. The loudest arguments live in academies scattered across the empire. Followers travel along river roads more than to feasts. The message spreads early into the east, where communities already know how to live faithful lives without a single temple as their anchor. The pattern of growth curves in a different direction, less Mediterranean, more Mesopotamian. The languages of early teachers tilt a few degrees towards the deserts and the twin rivers, and centuries later, the churches in Edessa and Nisibis do not feel like offshoots. They feel like the trunk. Some will ask, what of prophecy? What of the book that bears Daniel's name? If Daniel dies in the den, do the stories stop at that stone? Perhaps not. Narratives do not only survive by the breath of their heroes. Consider that the earlier court tales of Daniel, the diet, the dreams, the writing on the wall, may already have been known among his friends and protégés. The lion's den story, ending in martyrdom instead of rescue, would still carry a fierce power. Its lesson would shift. Instead of angels closing mouths, we receive a testimony to endurance unto death, and to the cost of faith under legal pressure. Such stories do not weaken a people. They sculpt them differently. Does the absence of a triumphant proclamation from Darius rob the empire of a reason to admire the God of Israel? Yes. But admiration is not the only soil in which resilience grows. Sometimes respect shapes policy. Sometimes suffering shapes character. In this thread of history, the Jewish community leans earlier and harder into a kind of sanctity that travels light. Portable texts, portable rhythms, windows open toward a city that fewer will see. The map still holds Jerusalem, but the heart learns to beat in more than one place at once. Persia itself changes in small ways that accumulate. An empire's soul is written in memos as much as monuments. Without the king's edict that once praised Daniel's God, the administrative tone remains more formal, the tolerance more transactional. Governors manage peace by latticework, not by large gestures. The result is an empire that survives as long as it did in our world. But when pressure comes, from Macedonian phalanxes or internal struggles, it lacks a set of stories about brave truth-tellers vindicated at the center. It has stories of brave truth-tellers crushed and communities that learn to survive anyway. Stability remains, but inspiration thins at the top, thickens at the bottom. Look again at the den, at that single hinge. In the familiar dawn, a king's voice cracks, and an old man answers. In this dawn, silence teaches. The conspirators, who in the original story are thrown to the lions and whose fate underscores justice, now go on. They do what survivors with ambition do. They cultivate caution in others. That caution ripples through the spirituality of the age. It does not erase prayer. It changes its posture. It does not stop devotion. It teaches it to whisper. And yet, people are endlessly inventive in how they keep hope. Families set aside a corner and call it Jerusalem. Children learn, not only through temple courts, but by fireside stories. Songs travel soft along canals. When communities are scattered and centralized power thinks it has won by making faith small, faith often becomes not smaller, but finer. It flows through cracks. It weaves around obstacles. It binds people to each other in ways that buildings never could. Centuries later, as our speculative map reaches into the Roman period and beyond, the absence of a strong temple state in Judea continues to reshape events. There is less open revolt under Roman governors, which means fewer brutal suppressions and perhaps fewer mass displacements at single points in time. The diaspora grows not by catastrophe, but by choice, by trade, by slow migration. The region tilts towards a mosaic of communities connected by letters, teachers, and seasonal journeys. When empires shift again, Byzantine, Sasanian, the communities already know how to navigate border changes with their identity intact. A different set of scholars rises in a different century, east of where we expect, writing commentaries that in our world would have waited longer to be born. This is the haunting truth of what-ifs. Some single moments reveal how much rides on one person's breath. In our known story, Daniel's survival opens a brief window in which a king speaks a better word over an empire, and that word may have nudged hands and hearts toward rebuilding. In this alternate path, a window closes. No proclamation, no legal reversal, no dramatic justice. But the people do not disappear. They adapt. They carry faith like a flame that now lives in lanterns, not in bonfires. What changes when a miracle becomes a memorial instead? The map, yes. Jerusalem less central, the diaspora more so. The politics, yes. Persian policy a shade sterner. Greco-Roman administrators dealing with a quieter province. The narrative, deeply. Stories of rescue replaced or joined by stories of costly fidelity. But perhaps the most profound change is in the kind of courage that becomes normal. Not the courage of lions' mouths closing, but the courage of opening windows when you're sure they're watching, of praying anyway, of remembering anyway, of teaching a child to face the right city, even if her feet never touch its stones. All of this remains speculative, educational, and offered with respect. The reality we inherited is the one we live in. But imagining the hinge helps us see the door. One life can tilt the room. One morning can inform a millennium. And when we look back at a den and a dawn, whether there is a voice or not, we marvel at how empires can be changed by a prayer, a law, a silence, and a story that still travels by candlelight.